All right, hello and welcome to the Carl Jackson Show, your daily dose of objective truth in a world of confusion and lies, or should I say, welcome back to the Carl Jackson Show. Guys, today Trump unveiled, what is it, Liberation Day, it's called, reciprocal tariffs. So this has been one of these days that, frankly, I got to tell you, I've been looking forward to simply because I wanted some stabilization in the market. I realized that this was going to be a back and forth kind of a tough road to hoe, so to speak. But I think this is best for the American economy in the long run. And so now I am joined by my guest, Antony, because he knows this stuff so much better than I do. He's an economist. Obviously, you know him with the Heritage Foundation. And listen, thank you for taking time with us today to sit with us and talk through this.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Okay, so I got to tell you right off the bat, I'm a little. How do I say this? I want to see. I realize this is best for the United States of America long term, or at least that's what I believe when it comes to these reciprocal tariffs. I don't trust Republicans. I trust Trump. I got to be honest with you. I'm a little more concerned that Republicans will get weak kneed before we get to the tariffs. Will get weak kneed and not follow this through with President Trump, which is why I'd love to see a big, beautiful bill or a permanent solution to Trump's tax cuts, Jobs Act, like right away. Your take on that?
Well, look, we have to remember that these tariffs have the potential to impose additional costs on American consumers. The idea that the entirety of the tariff gets passed on to the consumer, look, that just doesn't happen in reality. It's not true in economic theory. It's not true in economic history. But you are going to have some costs that make it through to the consumer, and you need to offset that. A very easy way to offset that would be to simply take the revenue that's coming in from tariffs and put that towards reductions in income tax rates. But that aside, we're also talking about a $4.5 trillion tax agenda that is part of this president's overall economic plan. So you're looking at $4.5 trillion in tax savings for consumers. And then you're talking about, in probably a worst case scenario, $450 billion of price increases due to tariffs. Again, that's a worst case scenario. And even then, you're talking about a ratio of 10 to 1. So the idea that somehow these tariffs are going to completely derail the economy and sink the consumer, I'm sorry, but the numbers just aren't there to support it, provided you actually get that tax agenda across the finish line that you're describing. So I agree, it's imperative that Congress work with the White House to actually make this a reality, because if they don't, you're not talking about saving people money on their taxes. You're talking about the biggest middle class tax hike in American history. So yes, you're 100% right. It's imperative that they get this done and that they get it done fast, because in the first Trump administration, one of the problems was it took so long to get the tax bill across the finish line. Markets had a terrible time, for example, when they thought, oh no, this just isn't going to actually get done. It's not going to get across the finish line. And it did in the 11th hour, right? It was, I think, right before Congress went away on Christmas recess that year that they actually got the tax bill done. So yes, get it done and get it done fast.
Yes. All right. So listen to Antony, Republicans, please get that done. I'm starting to get annoyed. I'm like, this is, I love what Trump is doing, but we should have some tax cuts in place. It's funny. Democrats get elected, and like on day one, they've got a package that they've hidden in the file cabinet and they're ready to go. And Republicans squabble and go back and forth and leave us hanging. And it just makes no sense to me. And we got Elon Musk out there. I'm ranting a little bit here, Elon Musk. I love the work, frankly, that he's doing with Doge. I know he's getting a bad rep, but I mean, this guy is helping to save the economy, helping to save the country.
Absolutely.
And I love what he's doing. And honestly, I wasn't even a big fan beyond this. I mean, I loved his smarts, but I was not an EV guy. I love what he was doing for space. But the fact that this guy would risk all of those businesses, risk his reputation, not getting paid, the Tesla terrorism, as I'm calling it, is absolutely unreal to me. And he's got my utmost respect. Just amazing what he's doing. Okay, so let's get to some of the specifics. And again, I'm speaking to Antony. He is an economist with the Heritage Foundation. You can find him on X at real EJ Antony, Antoni. He's really good. And what I love about EJ is when a person is really good at what they do because they make the complex simple. And he's able to do that for me. So I love just looking at some of the things that he says on Twitter. And then I might say I'm EJ and I might, take credit for him here and there. But nonetheless, he's that good. All right. So I love having him on. Let's take some of these things. Trump's plan imposes steep tariffs on the country of China. I'm reading from CNBC. This is a 34% tariff hike on China on top of the 25%, I believe it is already that's been smacked on China. No, 20% on China. So you're talking about 54% of tariffs on China. What does this mean for China? What does this mean for us, EJ Antony, as China is our largest foe out there?
It's a good question. I think this is all part of an effort to bring China to the table to get them to open their consumer markets to American exporters. That's what this whole reciprocity fight is about. Now, I'm not sure on some of these rates, quite frankly, Carl. I looked at the table that the White House put out, and I'm frankly very confused at some of the rates. I would love to see how they came up with these numbers. I'm not saying they're wrong. I just am confused by how they calculated the figures here. But whatever the case, these reciprocal tariffs are essentially about telling other countries, look, if you reduce your trade barriers, whether those are tariffs or non-tariff barriers, that could include things like quotas. It could include things like currency manipulation. China does both of those. Whatever the case may be, if the Chinese are willing to reduce those barriers and allow our exporters access to those Chinese consumer markets, like we have already done to them, right? Our consumer markets are wide open to Chinese producers. Then we finally have a level playing field. Then we finally have a situation where American exporters, American workers and companies can compete. And that's really what we want at the end of the day. So the beauty of reciprocal tariffs, if they are properly constructed, would be this. When other countries reduce or ideally eliminate their trade barriers, the United States will do exactly the same thing.
Okay, and we've seen that already with Israel coming out and saying, listen, basically a wash. No tariffs here. You guys don't slap tariffs on us. We'll get rid of our tariffs. Canada is at least saying it. It doesn't. I haven't seen any action as of yet when it's come to Canada. But basically, I guess what Trump is hoping for is essentially a wash when it comes to these tariffs. That essentially these countries will say, okay, just like Israel did. All right, we're not going to slap tariffs on you. You don't slap tariffs on us. Is that what you're expecting across the board, or perhaps more back and forth down the line?
I think it's going to vary country by country, Carl. You certainly are going to have some countries who bend the knee very early in the process because they understand how dependent they are on the United States, whether that's a nation like Israel that's incredibly dependent on us for aid, or if it's a nation that's just incredibly dependent on us for trade. Whatever the case may be, you're going to be hard-pressed to find a nation on this planet that does not need us more than we need them. And so one by one, I think as countries begin to realize that, and as they begin to realize that Trump holds all the cards in these negotiations, I think they're slowly going to give in. Now, will some take longer than others? Sure, absolutely. But at the end of the day, every country, I think, will eventually realize there are no winners in trade wars. There are only losers, but not everyone loses the same. And the longer they go toe-to-toe with us, the more they will realize that they are the bigger losers in that arrangement.
Okay, EJ, we only have a minute and a half left in this block. Just in general, because tariffs are new to a lot of people, if not most people listening to this program. So in general, people don't even know or realize how tariffs may have impacted them in the past, actually before Trump got in or started talking about this. So just generally speaking, is there an example that you can talk to the people about? Listen, this is how tariffs were impacting Americans and consumer prices, perhaps.
Oh, certainly. There are literally hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Americans that have been thrown out of work over the last couple of decades because the companies for which they worked couldn't sell their products overseas. And so, look, if you reduce the demand for American products on the world stage, you also reduce the demand for American labor. That means fewer American jobs. That means slower wage growth for American workers. All of these things have severely negatively impacted countless Americans and have helped create what we now call the Rust Belt. Now, to be clear, they weren't the only cause, but they've certainly helped exacerbate the problem.
Okay. Again, I'm speaking with my guest, EJ Antony of the Heritage Foundation. Great economist. Find him on X at Real EJ Antony. Just 20 seconds left in this block. I think when we get back, EJ, I'd like to talk to you about, frankly, some of our allies, places like, or friends at least, like Vietnam, how it's going to impact them. How do we do this? I'm seeing the left already stir these columns up. Oh, man, all these American companies are going to be hurt as a result of that. And so I want to talk to you about it. Nike, Apple, so on, et cetera. We'll be back with more with EJ and Antony on the other side. All right, welcome back to the program. Back with my guest, EJ Antony. Guys, please make sure you subscribe to the podcast wherever you go to get your podcasts, YouTube, Rumble, Apple, Spotify, you name it. All things social media at Carl Jackson Show, X, Instagram, and Facebook at Carl Jackson Show or at The Carl Jackson Show. EJ, where can people follow you? Is there a place you like besides X?
No, that's the one place where I post, all my daily reviews of data releases, post the articles that I write. I'll even post a lot of my media interviews too. So all the stuff's in one place there on X.
Okay. All right. Perfect. And for those of you tuning in, you'll be able to check out this interview as well over the weekend on the Salem News Channel. So make sure you tell your friends about it as well and tell them about the podcast. Okay. So you have outlets like CNBC. I'm reading from it now here, EJ, and the sky is falling already, talking about the Dow and the S&P and NASDAQ. And but they're also talking about shares of these multinational companies are tumbling and extended trading, Nike, Apple, so on, et cetera. But there is a legitimate question that I think people need answered is, okay, so let's say we have a lot of these companies that do business outside of the United States. A lot of these companies do business with, I believe it's Vietnam. And now, how are they going to be able to turn around and get their businesses going here in the United States? That's going to take some time, no?
Oh, certainly, Carl. But look, we have to remember that the whole argument of, well, it's going to take time, so we shouldn't do it at all, that's really a fallacy. That was the same argument that was made against the new technologies of horizontal drilling, for example. People said, look, this whole idea of hydraulic fracturing, horizontal drilling, it's going to take years before those wells are drilled and the product is actually brought to market. So why bother? But we went ahead with that anyway. And several years after we started that process, oil prices, natural gas prices plummeted, and they produced some of the lowest energy prices that we had seen in literally decades because of that. So there's that. Just because it's going to take time doesn't mean that we don't want to start the process now. In fact, you could argue it's all the more reason why we need to start it immediately. But that aside, look, the whole idea of tariffs, it's not a cure-all. We have a lot of people who have frankly become, I think, cartoonishly pro-tariff, and that's not a good thing. Tariffs are part of an overall strategy. They go hand in glove with this president's tax and regulatory agenda. By reducing marginal tax rates, by reducing regulatory burden, you make it cheaper for folks to produce here, to employ more Americans. If let's say the average manufacturing employee makes about $50,000 or $60,000 a year right now. Well, you can add on to that in terms of the cost of employment another $50,000 or $60,000 because of regulatory compliance costs.
Wow.
So what looks like a $50,000 or $60,000 employee to you and I is actually a $100,000 or maybe a $120,000 a year employee to the employer. Now, those are unnecessary costs that have been imposed by the regulatory state in this country. So if you can cut that bureaucratic red tape, if you can reduce that burdensome regulation, at the same time, you reduce marginal tax rates on these companies, you can get the kind of manufacturing renaissance that this administration is talking about. So on the one hand, you are going to disincentivize producing overseas, and on the other hand, you're going to incentivize producing here at home. So again, it's a hand in glove approach. It's not as if tariffs by themselves are going to be this kind of economic cure-all that some are saying they will.
I'm so glad you said that, EJ, because frankly, you do see the people that are tariffs, 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 and then you see the people that are never tariff, never tariff. And I mean, this is a package deal. This is used as leverage. Trump is essentially bringing jobs back to the United States of America. You're right. Deregulation, that's going to play a huge part. Lower taxes, that's going to play a huge part. And so I love this. I see this in the long run, and I understand there's going to be a little pain in the meanwhile. But I understand people are also, they've gone through pain with Biden inflation, that whole fiasco of a presidency. And so people are feeling a little pinch. But I do believe in the long term, this is going to be so much better. For one, just having materials like pharmaceutical materials produced in the United States. And I think we will have what's considered, I'd love to get your take on this, what Trump has coined, I believe he's coined, maybe it was you, EJ, actually, now that I think about it, a real economy, basically where you have jobs, you have jobs, you have manufacturing here. We start flourishing again here. I don't believe that all the manufacturing jobs of the past will come back, but certainly new, inventors, entrepreneurs, innovation will spark up. And so your take on that?
I agree. You're not going to see all the manufacturing jobs of the past come back, nor, frankly, do we want them all to come back. For example, I don't want people producing goods that are completely outdated. Right? There's a reason why we have car factories today, and why we're no longer, building buggies to tow behind horses, or the saddles to put on those horses. Right? And the other thing is that as we start, or I should say, as we continue the process of automation, that takes care of a lot of other more strenuous jobs. Now, you may say, well, what happens to the folks who used to be employed in those types of industries? You will always have new types of manufacturing employment. One thing gets taken care of by a robot, or just completely goes away because the product's no longer used, but it's replaced by something else. This whole idea of aggregate demand is frankly a Keynesian fallacy. Demand is infinite. We have unlimited, not limited, we have unlimited wants and needs. And so once something becomes cheaper, because let's say a robot is making it, we now have more disposable income to spend on other things. And that's why new industries are constantly popping up. And so I have no doubt that if this is done right, it will result in more growth, in more output, in more manufacturing jobs, not less.
When you say if it's done right, just quickly, we got 4 minutes left. What does that mean? I've got some more questions that I'd like to ask, but what does that mean? When if you were in Trump's shoes, how would these tariffs be implemented?
I would be laser focused on making sure that we're talking about actual reciprocity here, and not simply some kind of shotgun, scattershot, or nearly random approach to how we're levying these tariffs. You need to make absolute sure, again, with pinpoint accuracy here, that you are levying tariffs on other countries based on their tariff and non-tariff barriers. That's what you need to focus on.
So it should be, so for instance, Taiwan, I see here, I did not know they were charging us 64% tariffs in Taiwan. I don't know if that's overall in general. I don't know. I heard Trump mention a motorcycle or something like that, where motorcycles from there, I guess we bring in, they pay a 2% tariff. We pay 64%, and they're a friend. I had no idea. Do we do stuff like that because they are a friend? Are they considered a developing nation? I'm looking at this, and I got to be honest with you, EJ. I'm like, Why haven't we corrected this sooner? This is
Well,
insane.
Carl, that's a great question. I think it's because we just haven't had leaders in this country, whether the president or people in Congress, who have been willing to fight for Americans. You have tariffs and non-tariff barriers that were put in place right after World War II, for example, because essentially what was happening was you had the defeated nations who needed to rebuild their economies. And so all these trade barriers were allowed to be put in place so that American goods couldn't actually be sold in those locations. In other words, it provided an artificial boost to Germany, to Britain, to Japan, to Italy, etc. And there's no reason to continue to have those things in place today. But again, I really encourage the White House to show their work on these numbers so that they can demonstrate to us here at home and to other nations abroad, look, these are the things that you need to change in order to get our tariff rates on you to go down.
Okay, let me and that's a great point. Let me ask you this: we a minute and a half left. When can Americans? And I know there's no way possible to pinpoint this. I don't know if it was Lutnick. I heard 6 months or a year. I believe it was him who said it. But when should Americans start looking for some relief and start seeing the fruits from these tariffs?
So a lot of these different tariff and non-tariff barriers that we're talking about here were actually put in place after World War II, and they were all done to allow defeated nations or destroyed nations the opportunity to rebuild their economies. So they were protected from competition from American exporters. The problem is we left these things in place long after German car companies got back on their feet, long after the electronics industry in Japan was going gangbusters. So all of these things, they have long outlived their usefulness and they need to go. On top of that, we have allowed continuous trade agreements in this country where we keep opening up our consumer markets more and more to other countries, except we don't demand that they do the same thing for us. So we are perpetually putting our own exporters and our own workers at a disadvantage on the world stage.
It's like suicide, death by 1,000 cuts, and we're the ones that are cutting ourselves. 20 seconds left here, EJ Antony of Heritage Foundation.
I agree 100%. And it's a slow bleed, and you need to stop the bleeding at some point. Like you said, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And hopefully this is the first step in stopping all of those cuts. And once you do stop that bleeding, then the patient can heal. The patient can start getting better.
All right. I love it. We'll leave it there at Real EJ Antony on X.